So I had an amazing comedy of errors. This is so there was like a meta story with trying to get access to the documentary in terms of like the corporate structures that I was encountering and trying to get access to this documentary because I kept getting signed out of all of my accounts and had to reset my Apple TV. It was kind of a disaster. But what I did is I went and started doing some primary source deep dives uh, on
Okay.
Lollapalooza. And so I have brought some memories deep from the bowels of the internet, including the 1995 CMJ issue
Oh, wow.
on Lollapalooza to kind of give us a little bit of context. It's an interesting aesthetic journey. Let's just say there's also tips for how to do a road trip embedded within their guide to Lollapalooza.
How to do a road trip. Find your friends that love the Grateful Dead. A little road trip. They'll tell you how to, do something strange for drugs.
Yes.
I watched the documentary because I've been trying to write this essay for a heavy metal compendium, and it's all about capitalist reproduction and the end of hair metal, and kind of challenging the notion that the genre really just petered out because of alternative. There's a lot of other factors. I do think alternative music plays a factor, and for me, a big reason why alternative music plays a factor is the early days of, let's just call it hair metal for all intents and purposes. Don't like the name. Can we just okay, yeah, pop metal. Sorry, I don't know if you're a genre name snob like me. I just hate them. I hate them.
No, they all change all the time anyways.
Yeah,
They're
and after,
ephemeral.
right, no one ever sat there and was like, oh, dude, we gotta do here. Anyway, we're gonna be an alternative band. Like, if you said that, you sucked.
Yeah.
Like, don't trust those people. They are not cool. But that music originally was a lot more aggressive, and I think the bands that really made it, starting with Ozzy, it was kind of like, let's sand off the rough edges of your heavy metal soul. I don't know, of your whole heavy metal sound. Let's make this a lot more accessible. And with the success of that, then you get the Quiet Riots and the Motley Crues and all these other bands. And MTV, I think, is a major factor for all this. But what happens is that music really soon, probably by 85, gets real cut and paste. 86, definitely you get bands like Poison, which is just a really bad 3D copy of Motley Crue. And by 87, you have bands citing Poison as an influence. It's like, well, they just came out last year. How can they be influencing you? It's very visual. But in the college radio world, you don't have as much MTV support. There's only a small handful of bands that probably even have enough money to do a video. I think people don't really understand how expensive a cheap video was in the 80s. It was still probably a 6-figure ordeal. So there's something organic about college radio, and definitely when it gets a little more aggressive, the people that liked a more aggressive side, the shout at the devil people, they're like, well, this stuff is getting kind of candy, but man, there is something brewing over here.
Pay no attention to the cod pieces that they're
well, the thing about that is, I don't know if you would agree. Would you agree that they're also taking a little bit of that hardcore scene that's really popular? I'm talking about like early 80s.
Yeah.
There's a lot, because there's a lot of spikes in that world as well.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, they're taking sort of the early, like the Judas Priest aesthetic.
Yeah.
With the kind of like the BDSM sort of overtones and like kind of spinning them out to their kind of nonsensical conclusions.
Well, because this is how I feel, and I don't know if you feel the same way. If you were in a non-metal band, it really wasn't about the show.
Yes.
It was about the gig. And the metal guys were always about the show because they to be adjacent to fame, which is why scenes never really blew up out of their hometowns. They all went to Los Angeles because that's where you go get famous. Whereas this music really stayed, like Athens, for example,
Mhm.
is going to tell you that Athens is the epicenter for music stardom. But there's the B-52s, there's REM. Is Pylon from
Pylon.
Athens?
Yeah, there's another one. Yeah, the show, I mean, the only, like, truly crossover, like, metal band that is kind of in the indie circuit that I can think of is Gwar. With, like,
Mm.
real, like, bona fide punk
Mhm.
roots,
Mhm.
but that are, like, very but they're not a hair band. I
No. No. They're
that's not
they're a
what it's
hardcore band that understood the show, right?
Yeah.
Kiss. They're maybe the Kiss of hardcore. Someone says it's B-52 from the '90s. No, that
No.
79, I think, is that first record.
Very early. Yeah, they predate REM by like 3 years, and they're very much, like, instrumental in kind of bringing together that, like, weirdness of the Athens scene, which is very much like, you can't talk about Athens without putting it in the South and, the university system in Georgia and kind of the Sun Beltification of the South is very much
Mm.
like what the B-52s and REM are growing out of. Like, you wouldn't listen to them and think like, "Oh, this is a Southern band."
Not at all.
But they're part of this kind of like underground kind of bohemian culture that is always been in the South, but kind of spinning out in new ways in the 80s and this, uh, you know, playing with kind of pop tropes, pop images as they were circulating in the late 70s.
Is that kind of a thing that maybe hamstrings that movement for a while? Is it's the bohemian bourgeois nature of the music and it being so arty?
Mhm.
Um, Even the New York sound, because I really think this is just my opinion, I don't know if you feel the same way. By the time you hit Nirvana, they've perfectly done the alternative thing. They can be played on college radio, but they can also be played in the hinterlands of the suburbs.
Mhm.
They're aggressive enough where they can cross over.
Yeah.
Do you think that some there's a little bit of pretension that keeps this music a little bit underground?
Yes. So the class dimensions of this, I think, are really important because so you have punk in the mid 70s, which is very much working class youth, white youth in particular, right? The
Mhm.
Ramones, Queens, outer boroughs, seeing the decline of the industrial economy, and there's this like sense of no future. And that is like deeply embedded in the punk aesthetic. Same in the UK, right? The mining economy is collapsing, urban spaces are getting underfunded, and punk kind of comes out of that. But then you get the kind of art rock new wave spin-off of the post-punk by the late 70s. So Talking Heads and Joy Division, which becomes New Order. And that is very much the like college set that is listening to new wave. And so there's this kind of class bifurcation in the underground. And new wave gets picked up on a lot of commercial radio stations.
Yes,
The
it does.
music industry is like, "Ooh, there might be some money here. These are the kind of consumers that we want." Whereas hair metal, I think, is remains very or goes more pop, but it remains working class as
Mhm.
metal does, kind of with those ties. And so Nirvana is able to kind of exist in both of those milieu, I guess, you could say, to use a college educated word. Uh,
Which is to me really interesting when we think about this moment in time, because I don't think people really understand these strict class lines in which a lot of this music is existing. I'm not going to lie and say that I was a huge fan of all the stuff that came out. I to this day don't understand REM. It's not for me. Um, but how did college radio become incubators for alternative and underground music, in your opinion?
Yeah, so college radio is one of these places that also kind of exists between, because obviously they're at colleges,
Hmm.
but these stations grow out of this desire by institutions in the 60s and 70s to prove their public value, their public service, and that they exist on the public airwaves. They want to serve communities that surround institutions. It starts out with very overtly kind of public service oriented programming. Like NYU's radio station in the 1960s had programming by the Urban League, for example.
Hmm.
And in the 70s, you would get lots of stuff of like, here's how to deal with inflation. And, here is now a religious service that's going to serve, the Polish American residents in, around the Bronx, coming out of Fordham or something like that. So it's this very clear desire to serve people who are not in the institution, even as it is sort of this thing done by mostly college students and community DJs. By the early 80s, though, there is these growing scenes that are really not looking to college radio. Ian Mackay and Discord Records they're not looking at college radios like there's our vehicle to superstardom and success. It just is that a lot of those college DJs want to are sort of, going to local shows. They're hearing this stuff. They want to play it on their radio shows. And so there starts to be this connection. And you get people like Bruce Pavitt at Sub Pop and near Seattle and Olympia, who start to kind of cross network those scenes, that
Hmm.
they're very consciously trying to say, like, I'm in this scene, but I want to hear what's going on in Portland and in Chicago and in
Hmm.
DC. And here I'm going to make a mixtape that like shows all of these different scenes and, Charlottesville and wherever. And so college radio is the institution that starts to kind of make those connections between all of these little points of light of what we would think of now as sort of the hardcore indie rock uh, scenes of the early 1980s is when this starts to cohere. And so they start to diverge from what's going on in the mainstream industry. I mean, really until the late 1970s, college radio and early 80s, most college radio is very major label. There aren't really a lot of small independent labels to play. Hip hop gets tiny little footholds here and there at certain stations. Maybe mixtapes are getting played on air.
I do want to say that I'm glad you mentioned that because, and I just going to real brief because you're on a roll and I feel like a douche for doing this, so I apologize. Um, College radio for me played a massive role in my understanding of hip hop because I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, where I believe you write about it in your book, where we actually have stations that played local artists. So for us growing up, if you were played on the college radio station, it was better than being played on like KMEL, which was a mainstream station where I was from. A, because hip hop didn't get played that much in the early 90s. There's still black stations that won't play it. And
Mhm.
B, by the time hip hop is being played on the radio, it's a certain style of music that I wasn't the biggest fan of. So college radio again, I was just for me in I would say all of California, because Southern California had some really important stations as well.
Mhm.
It really was a way to get your music out to everybody in the area because we
Yeah,
were
I mean,
all
there's
tuned in.
stories of, like, Common, when he was still Common Sense, like, sitting out in front of the University of Chicago's radio station
Mhm.
in, like 1986, 87, sometime that time frame, like, "I got a demo, like, you wanna hear my stuff?"
Yeah.
And because that was a way by then to get your stuff out there. Um, but all right, I'm gonna do some name dropping because
Do it.
I have recently I don't have it with me. Otherwise, I would like open it up and show you because I'm so proud of this. I recently met Harry Allen from Public Enemy,
Oh, wow.
and I had him sign my book because I was like, you and WBAU and Adelphi was so important, not just in getting hip hop onto radio, but the taking it from its original neighborhoods and bringing it up to the suburbs in Long Island. And Run DMC was hanging out at the station with them, and Public Enemy forms really quite literally at the station. And that what they were able to do, that, and this is like 81, 82, 83 that they're doing this. And Bill Stepney goes from running the WBAU radio station to doing the first national hip hop chart in 1983 at CMJ. He compiles the beatbox chart, which is the first time. So they're doing what Bruce Pavitt is doing for indie rock at the same time. And so you kind of can't tell the story of college radio. And I think the hip hop story gets taken out of the indie rock story because of the way that alternative gets corporatized, particularly like REM is college rock, and it's going to be that vein of gold that they're going to trace. Whereas hip hop is very instrumental in shaping college radio.
Yes.
But it gets kind of pushed to the side, and it's got kind of a different sort of corporate story. And I think because a lot of the commercial politics, I guess, within hip hop
are we still in a racialized? Are we still in a racialized moment though with music? Where, because I talked about this with David Garfield the other day, that a lot of, again, I hate the term yacht rock, so let's just call it adult contemporary, right?
Yep.
But a lot of adult contemporary, for me, was Black people. Patrice Rushen, Luther Vandross, Jeffrey Osborne. Even though these guys, the same people, are playing on all these records, they exist in very different lanes. They didn't get as much push on a mainstream level. It just existed on Black radio, which is what my Black parents listened to all the Black time. But do you feel the same could be said for hip hop in that sense, where all this stuff is working together? And Perry Farrell is someone that definitely listens to college radio. So his festival, in my opinion, really is what you can listen to on air, but in the mainstream lens, this is this crazy thing.
Yeah, I think there's this really interesting generational transition happening in the 80s that tracks in weird ways onto these different genres. So I was just talking to another historian friend of mine, Austin McCoy, who you should absolutely meet. He's writing a book on De La Soul.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Look that shit up. Yeah.
and he's an amazing historian. He's a labor historian, right? So he's very cognizant of all of the class politics of this. And we're basically the same age, and our parents are the same age. And we just recorded a podcast episode together, kind of comparing the music that we were exposed to through our parents, kind of versus what we were listening to. And we were sort of mixing in sort of like the mixtape format into the discussion, less kind of the radio stuff. But, so his parents had like Cameo and, like all of the Jackson siblings records. And, and I went and, like, speaking of cod pieces. So for this episode, I went and like listened to Cameo. I had never listened to Cameo. I'd heard Sade, which was like the other tape that his parents had. And like I put on a Cameo video, and this guy's like dancing around in like a red patent leather codpiece, like the full. It is very like 80s glam hair metal aesthetic.
Point guitars,
but it's like R&B, like pop, clearly for Black audiences, who are not probably teenagers. Like it was more of that adult contemporary listener, and then like young Austin was like, oh, like the I forget which Jackson sibling it was.
Jackson, Centipede. Jermaine Jackson.
And he's like, there was like this record cover that he had, which was like he was saying he had like all this black leather on, and he looked like scary. He was like outside of a house. It was like
this Jermaine Jackson.
He's like that record album like really scared the crap out of me. So fast forward to the mid 90s, he's trying to get a hold of like gangster rap, and, his parents are not listening to that at all.
Yeah.
Whereas like my dad like still kind of was listening, like he would listen to REM, like he would listen to the stuff that was kind of coming out of these underground. So there's these kind of interesting breaks. So Perry Farrell is listening to more like what my dad is listening to, but also kind of getting these shades of the kind of hip hop that was appearing on college radio.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the commercialization of hip hop is very different. It follows a different path than what's happening in indie rock. The independent label thing is it has kind of a different trajectory. Like there are independents at work, but it doesn't kind of define
No,
the
there is
genre, and it's
there
way that
is
does with rock.
do